What happens when a cowboy worth millions, who counts cash instead of heartbeats, rides back to his dusty old ranch? The Wild West doesn't care about your wallet. It's got a way of digging up secrets that bite harder than a rattlesnake. Stick around to see how a man's empire crumbles when the past comes knocking. The sun baked the cracked earth of Willow Creek Ranch until it looked like a shattered plate. Silas McCrae, a man whose name jingled louder than his spurs, steered his black gelding through the sagging gate. 20 years had passed since he last saw this place, and it showed. Fences leaned like drunkards, the barn sagged worse than an old man's shoulders, and the wind carried a faint stink of neglect. Folks in town had heard he was coming, their whispers sharp as barbed wire. The millionaire cowboy was back, and they were betting he'd trip over his own pride before sundown. Silas, with his tailored leather coat and a wad of cash thicker than a Bible, figured he'd buy his way out of any trouble. The West, though, had a habit of laughing at men who thought money could tame it. He dismounted, boots kicking up dust that clung to his trousers like a bad reputation. The ranch house stood defiant, its warped boards creaking under the weight of memories. Silas squinted at the horizon, expecting a neighborly wave, or at least a curious stare. Nothing. Just silence, thick as molasses, broken only by the gate's rusty groan. Back in Denver, he'd built a fortune on cattle deals and clever bets. But here, his wealth felt like a heavy coat in July, useless and suffocating. He'd come to sell the ranch, maybe flip it for a profit, but something in the air tasted wrong, like a storm brewing behind clear skies. The townsfolk weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. Old man Tucker, who owned the spread next door, had already sent a boy to snoop around, asking if Silas was here to stir up trouble. Stir up trouble? Silas chuckled, but it came out dry, like he was trying to convince himself. He'd left this place to escape ghosts, his father's temper, his mother's silence, and a promise he'd broken to someone he barely remembered. Now, standing on his own porch, he felt like a stranger, trespassing on his own land. Money could fix the fences, maybe even the barn, but it couldn't patch up whatever was waiting for him inside those walls. As evening settled, Silas lit a cigar, the smoke curling like a question mark. He'd heard rumors in town, something about a man asking about him, someone who didn't sound friendly. The thought gnawed at him, not because he was scared, but because he wasn't used to being caught off guard. Out here, surprises were rarely the good kind. He patted his horse, muttering, "Well, boy, let's see what this place has left to throw at us." The West didn't care about his bank account, and deep down, Silas knew it was already sizing him up for a fight he hadn't planned on. The saloon in Willow Creek smelled of stale whiskey and sweat-soaked leather. Silas McCrae pushed through the bat-wing doors, his boots thudding against the warped floorboards. Lanterns cast flickering shadows, making the room feel like a stage set for trouble. He'd come to gauge the town's mood, maybe buy a round to loosen tongues, but the air turned heavy when he stepped inside. Every eye followed him, some curious, some sharp as a blade. Silas nodded to the barkeep, ordered a bourbon, and leaned against the counter, pretending the stairs didn't itch. Then the door creaked again, and a man walked in, tall, black, with eyes like winter frost. He wore a duster coat, frayed but clean, and carried himself like someone who'd seen more than he'd say. The saloon went quiet, glasses pausing halfway to lips. He stopped a few feet from Silas, close enough for the cowboy to smell the dust on him. "Silas McCrae," the stranger said, voice low but steady. "I'm your son, and I'm not here for a hug." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Silas's bourbon glass froze an inch from his mouth, his mind scrambling to catch up. Son? He'd left no family behind. Or so he'd told himself for 20 years. The saloon's silence felt louder than a stampede, every patron now a witness to a drama they'd gossip about for weeks. Silas forced a laugh, but it came out brittle. "You got the wrong man, friend. I don't have kids." The stranger didn't blink. "You knew my mother, Eliza Jones, back in '53. Left her with a promise and a baby. That's me, Isaiah Jones." His voice carried no anger, just cold fact, like he was reading a wanted poster. Silas's stomach twisted. The name Eliza sparked a memory. A summer night, a fleeting romance, and a vow he'd buried under ambition. He set his glass down, hand steady despite the tremor in his chest. "You're mistaken," he said, but the lie tasted sour. Isaiah stepped closer, his shadow falling across Silas's boots. "Mistaken, or you just don't like the truth catching up." The room held its breath, waiting for Silas to draw or deny. He did neither, just stared into those icy eyes, seeing something he couldn't name, maybe himself, maybe regret. The saloon was no place for this fight, but the West had a way of turning any room into a battlefield. The night air clung to Willow Creek like a damp shirt, heavy with the scent of sagebrush and trouble. Silas McCrae sat by a crackling campfire outside his ranch house, the flames spitting sparks that died before they hit the stars. His bourbon sat untouched on a flat rock, the saloon showdown still burning in his mind. Isaiah Jones's words, "I'm your son," looped through his head like a bad song, each repeat tightening the knot in his chest. He'd built an empire on cattle and cunning, but now a stranger's claim threatened to unravel it all. Word of the saloon scene spread faster than a prairie fire. By morning, every rancher from here to the county line was whispering about the millionaire with a secret son. At the general store, old lady Hawkins smirked over her coffee, saying, "Silas thought he could buy silence, but blood talks louder." The blacksmith, wiping sweat from his brow, chuckled to his apprentice, "Nothing like a family mess to spice up a dull summer." Neighbors weren't just gossiping. They were betting on how long Silas would last before the past buried him. Back at the campfire, Silas poked at the embers, the stick snapping in his grip. He'd always played life like a poker game, bluffing his way to the top. But Isaiah's face, those eyes, that jaw, looked too much like a mirror for comfort. He remembered Eliza Jones now, her laugh like a summer breeze, and the promise he'd made to come back for her. He hadn't. Money and ambition had pulled him to Denver, leaving her behind like a forgotten debt. Now the debt was sitting across a saloon, demanding payment. The fire popped, and Silas glanced at the dark horizon, half expecting Isaiah to step out of the shadows. He didn't. Instead, the silence mocked him, reminding him he was alone on a ranch that felt less like home every minute. He'd come to sell this place, to cut ties with a past he'd outrun. But the West didn't let you outrun anything. It dragged your mistakes back, dusty and sharp, to face you head on. Silas muttered to the flames, "I've beaten worse odds than this." The words felt hollow, like a bet placed on a losing hand. Life, he realized, was dealing the cards, and he had no idea who held the deck. Dust swirled across Willow Creek Ranch as the morning sun climbed, painting the prairie in harsh gold. Silas McCrae stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching a trio of riders approach from the north. Their hats were low, their postures stiff. Not the neighborly kind of visit. He'd heard the murmurs in town. Folks who once tipped their hats now saw his return as a chance to settle old scores. The ranch, with its sagging fences and untamed acres, was a prize they'd been eyeing since he left 20 years ago. Old Man Tucker led the pack, his weathered face set like stone. Flanking him were the Carter brothers, known for grabbing land faster than a coyote snatches a hen. They reined up 20 feet from the porch, their horses snorting clouds of dust. Tucker spoke first, his voice gravelly. "McCrae, you stirred up a hornet's nest with that saloon stunt. Folks say you got a son. That true?" Silas sipped his coffee, letting the silence stretch. "Folks say a lot of things, Tucker. Most of it's wind." The older Carter brother, lean as a fence post, leaned forward. "A son means trouble, inheritance disputes, land claims. We're just looking out for the community." Silas almost laughed. Community? These men smelled profit, not charity. His land was prime grazing, and his family drama gave them an excuse to circle like vultures. Tucker added, "You planning to sell? Might be easier than fighting ghosts." The threat hung there, plain as the revolvers on their hips. Silas set his mug down, the clink loud in the morning quiet. "This ranch is mine. Always will be. You want it, you'll have to do more than talk." The Carters exchanged glances, their hands twitching near their guns. Silas stood steady, his own revolver tucked under his coat, but his heart pounded. He wasn't just defending dirt, he was defending the McCrae name, the one he'd built into a fortune. If Isaiah's claim was true, that name was all he had left to stand on. The riders turned their horses, leaving a cloud of dust and a warning. "We'll be watching, McCrae," Tucker called over his shoulder. Silas watched them go, the weight of their eyes heavier than the heat. The West didn't care about his money or his pride. It cared about power, and right now his neighbors thought he was losing it. The noon sun scorched Willow Creek Ranch, turning the air thick as molasses. Silas McCrae sat in the shade of his porch, his hat tipped back, staring at the horizon where dust still lingered from the neighbor's visit. Isaiah Jones stood at the edge of the yard, leaning against a fence post, his silhouette sharp against the glare. He'd shown up unannounced, his presence like a burr under Silas's saddle. The millionaire gripped his chair's armrest, trying to read the man who claimed to be his son. Isaiah broke the silence, his voice cutting through the heat. "You've got two choices, McCrae. Acknowledge me as your blood, or I'll fight you like any other man who's crossed me." The words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of a loaded gun. Silas tried to laugh, aiming for his usual bravado. "Fight me? Boy, I've bought out tougher men than you." His voice cracked, betraying him, and the glass of whiskey in his hand trembled like a leaf in a storm. Isaiah didn't move, his eyes locked on Silas. "This ain't about money. It's about what's owed. My mother waited for you, died waiting. You gonna make me wait too?" The accusation stung worse than a whip, dragging up memories of Eliza's face, her trust, and the promises Silas had let slip through his fingers like sand. He wanted to joke it off, to say something sharp, but his throat felt like it was full of gravel. Out here, trust was rarer than rain, and Silas had spent his life trading it for profit. He stood, setting the glass down with a clatter. "What do you want, Isaiah? Land? Cash? Name your price." Isaiah's jaw tightened, and for a moment Silas thought he'd draw. Instead, Isaiah stepped closer, his boots crunching the dry earth. "I want a father, not a banker. But if you can't give that, I'll take what's mine another way." The threat hung between them, raw and real, like a storm cloud ready to break. Silas felt the weight of every choice he'd made, every road he'd taken to avoid this moment. The prairie stretched out, silent and unforgiving, watching a man who thought he could buy his way out of blood. The evening sky over Willow Creek Ranch bled orange, casting long shadows across the parched earth. Silas McCrae stood at the edge of his property, squinting at a herd of strange cattle grazing where his land met Tucker's. Their brands were unfamiliar, a sloppy mix of letters that screamed trouble. He'd seen this game before, neighbors pushing boundaries, testing a man's nerve. But today, Isaiah Jones stood beside him, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, eyes scanning the horizon like he'd been guarding this dirt his whole life. Silas shifted, his own gun heavy under his coat. "Those ain't ours," he muttered, more to himself than Isaiah. The younger man didn't flinch. "They're Tucker's. He's marking territory, thinking you're distracted." Isaiah's voice was steady, like he'd already measured the fight ahead. Silas glanced at him, caught off guard by the man's calm. He'd expected a hothead, not this quiet resolve. It made him feel like a stranger on his own land, like he was the one who didn't belong. Two riders appeared, their silhouettes dark against the sunset. The Carter brothers, bold as brass, herding the cattle closer. Isaiah stepped forward, his boots kicking up dust. "Far enough," he called, hand steady on his gun. The brothers reined up, smirking. The older one, Jed, spat into the dirt. "This ain't your fight, boy. Tell your daddy to come talk." Isaiah didn't budge. "I'm here now. Move your cattle or we'll move 'em for you." Silas felt a jolt, pride maybe, or shame. He stepped up, shoulder to shoulder with Isaiah, but the wind seemed to mock his silence, whistling through the dry grass. Jed laughed low and mean. "Big man McCrae, hiding behind his kid. Land's no good if you can't hold it." Silas's fingers twitched, itching to draw, but Isaiah's steady gaze kept him grounded. The younger man didn't need to say it. This wasn't just about cattle. It was about proving who the McCraes were. The brothers turned their horses, leaving the herd behind, but their laughter lingered like a bad smell. Silas looked at Isaiah, searching for words, but none came. The ranch felt less like his own with every step they took back to the house. The morning sun hung low over Willow Creek Ranch, baking the ground until it cracked like old leather. Silas McCrae sat at his kitchen table, a ledger open, scribbling numbers he hoped would solve his problems. Money had always been his language. Buy out the trouble, grease the right palms, and walk away clean. He'd sent a rider to Tucker's place with an offer, $10,000 to keep his cattle off McCrae land. By noon, the rider returned, envelope unopened, with Tucker's reply scrawled on it, "Bullets talk louder out here." Silas crumpled the note, his jaw tight. He stepped outside where Isaiah was mending a fence, hammer striking nails with a rhythm that matched his own frustration. "Tried buying 'em off," Silas said, tossing the note into the dirt. Isaiah didn't look up. You know how to buy things, McCrae, but not how to protect them. The words cut deeper than Silas expected, sharp as a barbed wire fence. He wanted to snap back, but Isaiah's steady hammering kept him quiet, each blow a reminder of his own failures. By afternoon, Tucker's men were back, this time with a wagon loaded with wire, bold enough to start fencing off a corner of Silas's land. Silas grabbed his rifle, but Isaiah was already moving, his revolver glinting in the sunlight. "Stay here," Isaiah said, not asking. Silas followed anyway, his pride stinging more than his common sense. They found Jed Carter supervising the work, smirking like he'd already won. "This patch ain't yours no more, McCrae," Jed called. "Community says it's fair game." Isaiah stepped forward, voice calm but cold. "Community don't decide what's McCrae land. Move your wire, or I'll cut it." Jed laughed, but his hand hovered near his gun. Silas gripped his rifle, feeling the weight of every deal he'd ever made. Money hadn't stopped this fight. It had only made him a bigger target. Isaiah's stance, steady as stone, forced Jed to back off, but not before he spat, "This ain't over." As the wagon rolled away, Silas looked at Isaiah, who didn't return the glance. The younger man's words echoed in his head. Protect, not buy. For the first time, Silas wondered if his fortune was just a pile of paper the West would burn through. Moonlight spilled over Willow Creek Ranch, turning the prairie into a sea of silver shadows. Silas McCrae and Isaiah Jones sat across from each other at the campfire, the crackle of burning wood filling the tense silence. The day's standoff with the Carters lingered like smoke, but this fight was different. No guns, just words sharp enough to draw blood. Silas tossed a stick into the flames, his voice rough. "You think you can waltz in, call me father, and claim half my life?" Isaiah's eyes glinted, unyielding. "I ain't claiming your money, McCrae. I'm claiming what you owed my mother. Truth, not promises you broke." His words landed like a slap, and Silas flinched, remembering Eliza's quiet hope, the way he'd ridden off without looking back. He tried to deflect with a smirk. "Truth. Out here, truth gets you a bullet, not a legacy." Isaiah leaned forward, voice low. "Keep joking. It's all you've got left." The argument flared, each man digging in like a miner chasing a vein. Silas spat out his defense. He'd built a fortune from nothing, clawed his way up while others begged for scraps. "I made choices, Isaiah. Hard ones. You think I wanted to leave her?" Isaiah's laugh was bitter, cutting through the night. "You left because it was easier than staying. Don't dress it up as sacrifice." The words hit Silas harder than any fist, stripping away the stories he'd told himself for 20 years. Firelight danced on their faces, showing lines of anger and pain. Isaiah spoke of his mother's last days, her faded letters still carrying Silas's name. Silas countered with tales of his own, nights on the trail, deals that kept him alive, a life built on dodging regrets. But every jab felt like a mirror, reflecting a man who'd run from more than just a woman. "You're fighting for a future I didn't plan," Silas admitted, voice cracking. Isaiah's reply was quiet, final. "And I'm fighting for a past you can't erase." The fire died down, leaving them in near darkness. The land around them, the reason for their battles, felt like a bystander now. This wasn't about fences or cattle. It was about two men bound by blood, wrestling with truths neither wanted to face. The West watched, silent as their words hung heavy, waiting for one of them to break. The prairie around Willow Creek Ranch lay brittle under a merciless sun, the ground splitting like a broken promise. Silas McCrae rode the fence line, his horse's hooves kicking up dust that stung his eyes. The drought had gripped the land for weeks, turning streams to trickles and cattle to walking skeletons. Grass was gone, replaced by cracked earth that mocked every rancher's hopes. Silas wiped sweat from his brow, his fortune useless against a sky that refused to weep. Isaiah rode beside him, silent but watchful, checking water barrels that held barely enough to wet a man's throat. The tension from their campfire argument lingered, but the drought forced a truce. No one could fight when survival was the only game in town. Silas glanced at him, noting the way Isaiah scanned the horizon, not for enemies but for signs of rain. "You could have left," Silas said, breaking the quiet. "This ain't your fight." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "It's my land, too. Blood don't run from a fight." At the ranch, neighbors who'd once eyed Silas's land with greed now came begging for water. Tucker himself showed up, hat in hand, his usual swagger gone. "We're all hurting, McCrae," he said, voice hoarse. "Your well's the only one ain't dry yet." Silas wanted to send him packing, but Isaiah was already hauling buckets, sharing what little they had. The act stung Silas, not out of spite, but because it showed a strength he hadn't expected. Isaiah wasn't just staying, he was proving something, standing firm when he could have walked away. By evening, the two men sat by the well, passing a canteen. The cattle lowed pitifully in the distance, and Silas felt the weight of every dollar he couldn't spend to fix this. "Money don't make rain," he muttered half to himself. Isaiah nodded, his eyes on the cracked earth. "But blood holds you here when money don't." For the first time, Silas saw it. Isaiah wasn't fighting for a claim or a grudge. He was fighting for a name, for a place, for something Silas had spent years pretending he didn't need. The drought was squeezing them all, but it was showing Silas what held stronger than stubbornness. Family, whether he wanted it or not. The horizon glowed faint pink as dawn broke over Willow Creek Ranch, but the air stayed heavy with drought's cruel grip. Silas McCrae saddled his horse, the leather creaking under his hands, his mind still chewing on Isaiah's stubborn loyalty. Word had come late last night. Tucker and the Carter brothers wanted a meeting at the property line. No guns, just talk. Silas didn't trust it, but the dying cattle and bone-dry well left him little choice. He rode out, Isaiah at his side, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that hung like bad omens. At the border, Tucker stood with Jed and Amos Carter, their faces grim under sweat-stained hats. The usual taunts were gone, replaced by a weariness that matched the cracked earth. Tucker spoke first, his voice rough. "We're all bleeding out here, McCrae. No water, no grass. Let's split what's left of your well and call it square." Silas's gut twisted. Sharing meant survival, but it also meant admitting he couldn't hold his own. Before he could answer, Isaiah stepped forward, his boots planted firm. "This ain't about water. It's about honor. You pushed our land. Now you want our well." His tone was calm, but it carried an edge sharper than a blade. Jed Carter sneered, stepping closer. "Honor don't fill a canteen, boy." Isaiah didn't flinch, his eyes locked on Jed's. "Maybe not, but it keeps a man standing when cowards run." Silas watched, his chest tight. Isaiah wasn't fighting for land or even water. He was fighting for the McCrae name, something Silas had spent years turning into a dollar sign. For the first time, Silas moved to stand beside him, shoulder to shoulder, his silence louder than any words. The Carters shifted, uneasy, their hands empty but itching for trouble. Tucker raised a hand, signaling peace. "We'll share the well, McCrae, but don't think this makes us friends." They turned and rode off, leaving Silas and Isaiah in the dust. As they headed back, Silas glanced at Isaiah, seeing the man's resolve in the set of his jaw. "You didn't have to do that," Silas said, voice low. Isaiah's reply was simple. "Yeah, I did." The words hung between them, a bridge built on something stronger than money. The West was watching, and for once, Silas felt like he wasn't facing it alone. The midday sun scorched Willow Creek Ranch, dust rising like a storm as hooves thundered across the parched earth. Silas McCrae crouched behind a boulder, his revolver heavy in his hand, sweat stinging his eyes. The Carter brothers had come back, this time with 5 hired guns, their rifles glinting in the haze. No more talk. Just a hail of bullets tearing through the air like a swarm of angry wasps. Isaiah knelt beside him, his own gun drawn, his breath steady despite the chaos. The fight had erupted when Jed Carter tried to drive cattle through their land again, this time with no pretense of peace. A bullet chipped the boulder, spraying rock dust across Silas's face. He cursed under his breath, glancing at Isaiah. "You ready for this, boy?" Isaiah's eyes didn't waver. "Been ready since I walked into that saloon." They moved as one, back to back, like they'd been fighting together for years. Silas fired, his shot catching one of the hired guns in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. Isaiah's aim was truer, dropping another man before he could raise his rifle. The Carters scrambled for cover, their shouts drowned by the crack of gunfire. The air smelled of gunpowder and fear, the prairie itself seeming to hold its breath. Silas reloaded, his fingers steady but his heart pounding. He'd fought before, barroom brawls, land disputes, but this was different. This wasn't about his ranch or his money. It was about the man beside him, the son he'd never claimed until now. Isaiah ducked a shot, firing back with a precision that made Silas's chest tighten with something like pride. Keep your head down, McCrae, Isaiah shouted, a grim smile flickering. Silas grunted, returning fire. You're the one drawing their aim. The tide turned when Tucker's men hesitated, their numbers thinning. Jed Carter yelled something lost in the wind, and the remaining guns retreated, leaving dust and blood behind. Silas and Isaiah stood, panting, their guns still warm. The ranch was theirs for now, but the cost was written in the dirt, 2 men down and a rift with neighbors that wouldn't heal. Silas looked at Isaiah, their eyes meeting for the first time without anger. They'd fought not for land, but for family, and in that moment, the West's brutal lesson was clear: blood binds tighter than any deed. The morning after the shootout draped Willow Creek Ranch in a haze of gunpowder and silence, the air sharp with the tang of spent bullets. Silas McCrae stood on his porch, his boots scuffing the worn boards, staring out at the land he'd nearly lost. The cattle still stood, fewer now, grazing on what little grass the drought hadn't claimed. Isaiah was already at work, repairing a fence the Carter's men had torn down, his hammer striking with a steady rhythm that echoed like a heartbeat. Silas watched him, the weight of yesterday's fight settling into his bones. He'd spent 20 years building a fortune, thinking money was the measure of a man, but the bullet holes in his barn told a different story. Isaiah hadn't fought for a payout or a plot of dirt. He'd fought for a name, for a place to belong. Silas stepped off the porch, his spurs jingling faintly, and walked toward his son. You didn't have to stay, he said, stopping a few feet away. Isaiah paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Didn't have to. Wanted to. The words were simple, but they hit Silas harder than any bullet. The townsfolk would talk, of course. They'd spin tales of the millionaire cowboy and his long-lost son, of gunfire and grit under a blazing sun. But Silas didn't care. For the first time, he saw the ranch not as a ledger entry, but as something alive, tied to the man beside him. He clapped a hand on Isaiah's shoulder, the gesture awkward but real. This place is yours too, he said, voice rough. Isaiah nodded, his eyes on the horizon, where the prairie stretched endless and unforgiving. As the sun climbed, burning off the morning chill, Silas felt the West's laughter again. Not mocking now, but warm, like it was in on the joke. He'd lost cattle, money, and a chunk of his pride, but he'd gained something heavier. A son who'd stood by him when the world turned mean. The land was still theirs, scarred but standing, and so were they. The McCrae name wasn't just a brand anymore. It was a bond, forged in dust and blood, stronger than any bank vault. The sun dipped low over Willow Creek Ranch, painting the sky in hues of fire and shadow. As if the West itself was signing off on the McCrae saga, Silas McCrae leaned against the corral, his hands rough from a day spent mending what the fight and drought had broken. Isaiah worked nearby, branding a calf with the McCrae mark, his movements sure and steady, like he'd been born to this land. The ranch was quieter now, the scars of the shootout fading under new fences and fresh hope. Townsfolk still whispered, some with respect, others with envy, but their words no longer carried the sting they once did. Silas caught Isaiah's eye, and for a moment they shared a nod, no words needed. The millionaire who'd come to sell his past had found something worth keeping instead. The land wasn't just dirt, it was a legacy, one they'd both fight for, not with guns, but with grit. Isaiah had stayed not for a deed or a dollar, but because blood had pulled harder than pride. As the stars began to prick the sky, Silas felt the truth settle in. His empire wasn't in banknotes. It was in the man beside him, and the name they both carried. The prairie stretched out, vast and unforgiving, but for the first time, it felt like home. Well, folks, that's the tale of Silas and Isaiah McCrae, 2 men who learned the West doesn't care about your wallet, only your heart. Thanks for riding along with us through the dust and drama of Willow Creek. Your time and ears mean the world to this old storyteller, and I hope you felt the heat of the prairie and the weight of their choices. Where are you listening from today? Got a favorite moment, maybe the saloon showdown or that final nod under the stars? And what's a truth you've had to face, something that hit harder than a bullet? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep the campfire burning. Until next time, keep your boots dusty and your heart true.